What's up, Student Ministries? Welcome back to week 2 of our Holy Over Happy series. And while you might be thinking, oh man, I'm so glad I made it so that we could talk about suffering, let me just tell you that while you might feel like suffering is so 2020 and it's 2021, we're done talking about it, you may have realized a few days in that we're still very much in the same boat. And we're in this boat together. So while you may want to jump out and try swimming, while we're in it together, let's talk about it because we're experiencing somewhat of collective suffering right now in a way that we never have before. So let's jump in, so to speak. Too many boat references. Suffering. It's incredibly human to avoid suffering. It's why we don't purposely put our hands on a hot stove. It's why we wait until the very last minute to do our homework. It's why when we go to the dentist, we feel like we're gonna die. And it's also why running the mile is the worst. Except for you masochists out there who run for fun, and I don't really know what to say to you. But here's the deal, we all avoid suffering, and I am the queen of this. I love a good shortcut or a cut corner if it means I get to avoid something hard. It's why I refuse to watch movies like Marley and Me, even though you liars out there tell me it's totally worth it and it's such a good story. And it's also why if I know that a movie is sad or hard, or there's like a really awful part, I will fully fast forward until it's over. It's also why I will avoid traffic at all costs. I will literally drive the most ridiculous route to get somewhere just so I don't have to put my foot on the brake. And it's also why I'm not allowed to put furniture together in our house. It's easy to cut corners and want to avoid hard things. But what about this? What if, even though we avoid suffering because it's hard, what would it look like if we looked at our Christian life, if we looked at following Jesus as not just seeing avoiding suffering as normal, but we actually saw suffering itself as normal? And what if we took it even a step further and not only did we see suffering as normal, but we saw suffering as a blessing? It seems wild, but in reality, this is what following Jesus looks like. It's too easy for us, especially in our Western culture, to get this idea that life is all about easy breezy, beautiful, cover girl, but the idea that life should be simple and life should be fun and I should be happy all the time. But Jesus never says that that's what life following him will look like. The problem is we've let that seep into the way that we view following Jesus, and we've had these expectations of something that it shouldn't be. Following Jesus doesn't look like us living our best life. And here's the moment where you might be like, look, I'm down with God, but not if it means it's getting in the way of me living my best life. But I want us to start by asking this really real, honest question. What if God's view of you living your best life was different than what you thought living your best life should be? Would you still be down? Would you still be down to follow Jesus if it meant that God's view of you living your best life looks different than what you think it should be? I want you to take a second and talk about this in your community groups. And let's just start by getting real, because that is what this whole series is about. So pause the video and talk about it for a little bit. Yikes. I hope that didn't feel like too much of a buzzkill. But I think it's important that we talk about what following Jesus actually is. I don't want to bait and switch you with this idea that following Jesus means you'll live this happy, healthy, wealthy life and you'll never experience suffering. In reality, the way that the Bible talks about the Christian life is it actually promises suffering to us, that it's a normal part of what following Jesus is. But it's important that we answer the question, is it worth it? And do I believe that God is in it and that he has purpose in it? Because man, I can't tell you how many people I know at this point in my life that grew up with me even in the church that decided not to follow Jesus anymore because they couldn't understand how a God who claims to be good and a God who claims to love them would allow them to go through suffering. And it is a fair question, but it's important for us to talk about it. Following Jesus means surrendering our lives to him, believing that he works all things together for his glory and for our good. But it's important that we recognize it's not for our definition of what is good. But let's stop right here and ask the question, maybe you're in this place. Has it been hard for you to believe in God because of how your life has looked? Or if life is not hard right now, but you expected that it was going to get harder, would you have a hard time believing in God if life got harder than it was right now? So following Jesus, what is it? Well, the Bible has some pretty gnarly analogies when it talks about following Jesus. Jesus says things in Matthew 16 like it looks like losing your life to find it, or picking up your cross daily and following me. Or Paul in Romans talks about the idea of dying to ourselves, or even offering our bodies as living sacrifices. This is the kind of language that the Bible uses to talk about following Jesus, and yet we're surprised that it involves suffering. It's like signing up for a swim team and then being like, wait, I have to learn butterfly? Which, to be fair, is for sure the hardest stroke, and you mostly feel like you're drowning the whole time. But this is why this next part is so important, that if this was all following Jesus was, it wouldn't feel really worth it. If we're honest, right? It wouldn't feel worth it. You'd be like, that's literally what life looks like following Jesus. That sounds hard and not that interesting. I'm not interested. But that's why this next part is so important. So if you've gotten to this part, hang in there with me, because this is where the good stuff comes. While God doesn't promise us a life without suffering, He does promise us His presence in the midst of it. He doesn't promise us an easy life without suffering, but He promises His presence Himself in the midst of our suffering. And man, that's what makes it worth it. His presence. And man, I think it's so crazy because a lot of times we have so narrowed our view of what God's blessing in our lives should look like. We think it should look like getting the things that we want, getting into the school that we want, having the friends that we want, getting the grades that we think we should get, getting a boyfriend or girlfriend that we think we should have. But in reality, what if we took all of that away and we saw blessing as simply God's presence with us? Man, it would flip the script for us in the way that we viewed suffering. I love the story of the Exodus. Miranda touched on it last week. It's the story of God leading His people out of bondage of slavery in Egypt and leading them, delivering them ultimately to the desert. And what's crazy is you watch that story or you read it, watch The Prince of Egypt if you get a chance. It's one of the most cinematically beautiful experiences of all time. But you watch this story and you think, by all accounts, that's a really weird move on God's part. I thought He loved His people. He was going to protect them and save them. So He took them out of the desert He took them out of Egypt only to lead them into the desert. But what I love about that story is you watch God show up in crazy ways in the desert. That it's actually a story of God's protection and provision and care for His people. That in the desert, God provided for them and protected them in crazy ways. Like crazy ways like bread falling from the sky and God leading them in a pillar of cloud and fire kind of ways. It wasn't the fact that they were in the desert. By all accounts, that doesn't feel like a blessing. But God was with them in the desert, and that was the blessing. So I want to ask you this question. Do you feel like you're in the desert? How has God been with you? And if we're honest, does God's presence feel like the blessing in the midst of the desert? So, suffering is not a matter of if, but when, for those of us who call ourselves Christians. But our suffering is full of promise. God promises us He will meet us there. And even more than that, suffering is typically where we see God's presence the most. If there's anything 2020 did for me, it was kind of remove some of the calluses that I had towards being able to see what God was doing in my life. In Isaiah 43, God speaks through the prophet Isaiah to His people and reminds them of who He is to them and the ways that He promises His presence to them. So I'm going to have you read this in your community groups too, but let's spend some time reading this. I want you to close your eyes and just listen. But now thus says the Lord, He who created you, O Jacob, He who formed you, O Israel. Fear not, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by name, you are mine. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And through the rivers, they shall not overwhelm you. When you walk through fire, you shall not be burned, and the flame shall not consume you. For I am the Lord your God, the Holy One of Israel, your Savior. I give Egypt as your ransom, Cush and Seba in exchange for you, because you are precious in my eyes and honored, and I love you. I give men in return for you, peoples in exchange for your life. Fear not, for I am with you. I will bring your offspring from the east, and from the west I will gather you. I will say to the north, give up, and to the south, do not withhold. Bring my sons from afar, and my daughters from the ends of the earth. Everyone who is called by my name, whom I created for my glory, whom I formed and made. I want you guys to read this passage again together, and I want you to notice all of the ways in which God talks about the difficult things they will experience, and yet the ways that He is with them. Because, my friends, that is where the hope and the promise is found, even in the midst of our suffering.